So welcome back to the ESTSS Future Leadership Group podcast series. In each episode, we speak with leading researchers and clinicians shaping how Europe and the wider world understand trauma, recovery, and the system around them. I'm Dr. Yirmiya, a clinical psychologist and assistant professor at Ben Gurion University in Israel and an honorary senior research fellow at University College London. Until very recently, I was a postdoctoral fellow at UCL, where I had the honor of being supervised by Professor Peter Fonagy. It's a real pleasure to welcome him to the podcast. Professor Peter Fonagy is head of the Division of Psychology and Language Sciences at University College London and a co-developer of mentalization-based treatment. He is a clinical psychologist and psychoanalyst, had served 2 terms as a senior investigator for the National Institute for Health Research, and currently advises both NHS England and UCL partners on mental health strategy. He is chairing the UK government's independent review into mental health, ADHD, and autism services, and previously served for over 2 decades as chief executive of the Anna Freud Center. He has authored more than 800 peer-reviewed papers and over 25 books, with his work cited more than 160,000 times. And beyond those titles and honors, those who have trained with him know his remarkable commitment to nurturing the next generation. Peter, welcome. It's a real pleasure to have you here today.
It's a pleasure being here, except you read all that out. I already feel tired for reasons that I can't explain. But anyway, it's lovely being here, Karen, and thank you so much for asking me.
Thank you.
You were the most wonderful postdoc that I've ever had. So there you go.
No, thank you so much. So I thought before we dive into your work on attachment, mentalizing, and the evolution of mentalization-based treatment, including the more recent trauma-focused developments, that we'll start with a small tradition on this podcast. So we begin with asking something a bit more personal. I hope it's okay. So looking back at your PhD years or early research career, what was a slightly peculiar or not so great habit you had back then, and has any part of it followed you into your professional life today?
That's an interesting question, and one that is easy to answer, actually. What I started with in my PhD was an obsession about a particular idea, and it took me quite a few 2 or 3 years into the PhD before I realized that's not what I wanted to do, and I changed my mind altogether. And that made me a little bit later in delivering the PhD than I would have intended, and that has followed me to the tomorrow. I get these ideas and I pursue them, and then I realize, no, it's not quite right, and then it takes me a while to catch up. So changing minds is, I think, an important part of being a scientist and a researcher, and I hope that that has accompanied me into my more mature years. So I don't know whether it's any help to you, but that's what I would say is happened early and has kept on happening.
Yeah, and actually, I think many of us can relate to it. And I think something that I definitely learned from you is being very flexible in shifting between, research fields and ideas, and also having methodologies, different methodologies, and being able to explore a wide range of research fields is something that definitely.
Okay, so off you go with the questions.
Yeah, so I thought to start for listeners who may be less familiar with the concept of mentalizing, could you briefly explain what mentalization is and what makes mentalization-based treatment distinct from other therapeutic approaches?
Okay, so I'll answer both questions. I might be disappointing on the second one.
Mm-hmm.
Mentalizing is a core human capacity for understanding actions, behavior in terms of assumed states of mind, thoughts, feelings, beliefs, wishes, desires. It is a social capacity that helps one navigate oneself through the world by interpreting actions that one observes in terms of the putative states of mind that might be underpinning it, but is also, it turns out, a way that one actually understands oneself and one's own actions. And mentalizing is probably something that's as important for understanding how one is constructing reality around one. So it's three components, if you like. Mentalizing is, in part, a kind of theory of mind, a theory of other people's minds, but also it's an understanding of oneself in terms of mental states. And then thirdly, it's aligning all that with physical reality. Bringing that together is full mentalizing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Second question, why is mentalizing as a therapeutic approach effective and different from other therapeutic approaches? Here I have to say I don't think it is that different from other therapeutic approaches. It focuses on this aspect of people's capacity to think about themselves in mental state terms, think about others in mental state terms, but actually implicitly most therapies do that. They may focus on different areas of one's social interactions with others. If I'm doing psychoanalysis, then maybe I'm particularly concerned with non-conscious determinants of behavior, but they are still mental states. And if I'm doing CBT, it may be closer to conscious considerations and constructions of the world. But every therapy, psychological therapy, actually works towards improving a capacity of an individual to mentalize. So I would not want to say that MBT, mentalization-based treatment, is really that different from others. It is just that it is an approach where we focus on it. And we focus on it in a sense of observing when mentalizing is not working, and then try and make it work at both in relation to oneself and in relation to understanding others.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So if you want to take these ideas into the trauma field, getting closer to the topic of today's webinar, I wonder, can you explain us a bit? Maybe we can start by saying a bit more about how mentalizing is rooted in attachment theory, and from there we can start talking about developmental trauma or early life adversity and how that has to do with developing mentalizing throughout life.
Well, mentalizing assumes that the child is surrounded by a social environment that respects mental states, that the child is with parents, caretakers, caregivers, call them what you will, who are interested in their state of mind. And why is that important? That's important because that's how we learn about that facet of human mental function.
Mm-hmm.
It is, if you were living in a feral child in a forest being brought up by wolves, you would not learn to mentalize. It's a capacity that evolves in social context in order to make social life sustainable. That's an optimal picture. If the social environment is one that does not respect the child's mental state, they have to develop strategies that protects them. And attachment theory, I think, has been quite helpful in suggesting fairly effective strategies the way the child can avoid relying too much on the caregivers, or persist in signaling their thoughts and feelings intensely in order to get the caregiver's attention, should that not be forthcoming.
Mm-hmm.
When the child is frightened by the caregiver, then an attachment becomes disorganized. I don't think that insecure attachment, but it's avoidant or it's ambivalent, anxious, is actually that big a deal, although probably it's not as good in terms of enhancing mentalizing. Where it feels difficult is when the child is the social environment that's scary, that's frightening, and unpredictable. And we know that maltreatment or trauma is associated fairly powerfully with disorganized attachment. So to me, it's an environment that undermines mentalizing, because it becomes too dangerous to think about what people around one might be thinking that could result in unpredictable aggression or withdrawal, unpredictable neglect, or intrusion that is totally non-contingent, not related to my state of mind. So these areas of known predictors, be called, I don't think that really is a predictor, but it's are prequels of disorganized attachment, are, I am afraid to say, overlapping with trauma. So adversity that a child experiences, to me, is not necessarily traumatic. They can avoid, or they can intensify their attachment signals, and they can develop good strategies. But when they feel alone, when they can't turn to anyone to help them support adaptation, that's when adversity turns into trauma.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really like this definition of yours. The trauma is when the mind is left alone, right? There's no mind to hold your mind.
In mind.
Yeah. So if I take it one step, I'm building up to get to the MBT-TF and the current ongoing trial. But before that, I want to ask you something that I find myself wondering about it probably way too much, but I'm still, maybe others will be interested in as well, is that many people first encounter mentalizing in the context of personality disorder, and especially borderline personality disorder when you started with this theory. And if you had to make the case, I think you already started to touch upon it, but I'd like to maybe get more around the different definition and classification, and they're also shifting at the moment. So there's a lot of happening around those diagnoses. If you had to make the case for why mentalizing is equally central to understanding trauma, particularly maybe complex PTSD, what would be the simplest version of that argument?
Well, the simplest version is that a mind that's been traumatized withdraws from other minds, and withdrawing from other minds leaves you vulnerable in a social context. It's a traumatic experience does not only dysregulate emotion, it disrupts the capacity to make sense of oneself and others in terms of mental states. So trauma, particularly when interpersonal, can undermine trust in others, as I said, withdraw from others, withdraw from the communication that one is in receipt of in a normal social environment that's essential for adaptation and survival. But it also creates a sense that others are not reliable sources of knowledge. And that will render mentalizing fragile under conditions of threat. So MBT, as we apply it to trauma, is not about on revisiting traumatic memories in detail, but on restoring the individual's capacity to mentalize when they are aroused, when they are emotionally activated. Because emotions, intense emotions, undermine the capacity to mentalize in all of us. So one way of looking at complex trauma is that maybe it's a combination of two things. Maybe it's a combination of a failure to regulate emotion well enough not to disrupt mentalizing, that has a historical past that made the individual's mentalizing in those repeated contexts of neglect, maltreatment, rejection, whatever it is, that deprived them of the only capacity that would have protected them from being traumatized by the parents' behavior, that is a genuine, deep understanding of why they behaved as they did. What misunderstanding on their mind led them to behave as they do. So you've got two elements. You have a dysregulated attachment system that is vulnerable to mentalizing being disrupted. And second, you have a vulnerable mentalizing because it has been deprived of the social environment that would make it resilient to adversity and traumatic experience.
I feel like it really answers the question to me, and you've managed to answer it so clearly without mentioning personality disorders in the answer, which really makes me think that maybe we are, I mean, at least I am, or some of us are too preoccupied with the overlaps and the distinctions and different therapeutic modalities.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I was naughty but deliberate, and I should be transparent about it. I do not like the term personality disorder, and it is for several reasons, but mainly because it's pejorative. It suggests that there is something wrong with your personality. And my experience has been over the years that I meet some really lovely people who have been labeled personality disordered, and I've met some really awful people. But I've also met some really awful people who have not been labeled personality disordered, and I've met some really lovely people by the opposite description. That say, I don't think personality is the good word, and I thought, what? I don't think it's a disorder. It's a vulnerability. And it's a vulnerability that's born of, it's an emotional intensity disorder. It's a group of people that experience their own emotions very intensely for two reasons, and I go back to my previous explanation. Because they can't mentalize that emotional experience. They experience it much more as a physical experience almost. And because their disorganized attachment has prevented them from acquiring the capacity for emotion regulation that secure attachment usually gives young children have an opportunity to benefit from.
Mm-hmm.
So, do I want to call it personality disorder? Not really. It's an emotional intensity disorder where you feel that what you're feeling is true, is definite. It's without question. And that, of course, sends you another spin of, oh my God, if it's true, if I really am going to be destroyed by this experience, then I really should be very frightened and feel whatever I'm feeling in spades. So, complex trauma, in a way, is a history of experiences where children sequentially have felt misunderstood, the communications that they received were misunderstood by them, but also the parents' communications or other people's communications have been poorly conceived. They didn't relate to the child's experience. So in that kind of communication confusion, children have to adopt strategies that are maladaptive. And I think that's what we see in complex trauma.
Mm-hmm. So how do you feel about the term developmental trauma? Is it a term that you prefer, or
it's fine, developmental trauma is fine. It's a bit of an oxymoron. Tell me about the trauma that's not developmental. We know that if you have a car crash, that's not a developmental trauma, but you're more likely to respond with PTSD if you had adversity in your childhood and you come to the experience with vulnerable mentalizing. You can't make as easily as good sense of your own emotional reactions, even though it's an isolated incident. Same applies to war trauma. Trauma is by nature developmental. You bring to a traumatic experience, even if it's isolated, what how your brain has evolved over the previous X number of years. So, tell me a trauma that's not developmental.
Yeah. And I'd like to move on now maybe to what we do as clinicians when coming to treat these patients that we've just described. So can you tell us a bit more about the MBT-TF and how does this intervention looks like? Maybe elaborate a bit more on the group aspect of MBT, because I think it's also a huge component in how we see treatment for this population.
Okay, so trauma often leads to an oscillation between being hypervigilant and over-interpreting others' intentions, we call hypermentalizing, or withdrawal, a kind of emotional numbing of hypermentalizing. MBT-TF works by helping patients recognize these shifts from one to the other, slow them down, and reestablish the capacity to reflect on the present moment. So the therapist has to adopt a collaborative, not knowing stance that prioritizes those two arms that I talked about, prioritizes affect regulation and the clarification of misunderstanding. So you repair ruptures within the therapeutic relationship. And that's what's therapeutic. It's the repairing of ruptures. It's not being super understanding. Hyper mentalizing actually just triggers further worries. What happens is that in the repair of the ruptures, when you encountered a failure of mentalizing, a failure of communication, and you bring mentalizing to it, the individual gradually learns how they can be better in tolerating painful emotions, revise rigid interpretations of experience, a kind of a definite sense of I know what's going on here, a kind of short-circuiting it, engage in a more flexible relationship. So MBT addresses trauma not solely through the exposure or symptom reduction, by rebuilding the relational context, the epistemic capacities that trauma has compromised. Now, this is where groups come in, because it is our view that actually this sense of me not being understood and the expectation that I won't be understood by who I'm talking to, and I'm likely to be further traumatized, and a sense of, maladaptive communication that will ultimately lead you to a repetition of the trauma. That exists less when other people around the traumatized person are known also to have been traumatized. So in a group where everybody has trauma, I think people mentalize each other better. They had probably a better understanding of the other person sitting next to them who has had a trauma experience, even their experience was completely different from their own, than they do of the therapist. So there is greater trust. And that trust is an essential component of the therapeutic process. Because as a therapist, I'm always treated with much more suspicion. I'm hypermentalized. The patient is trying, the traumatized patient is trying to figure out what may be behind my apparent positive attitude. But when they are with other traumatized, they understand them better. And that sense of mutual understanding is how mentalizing develops. So I now feel quite strongly that if you try and treat individuals who have been traumatized as a sole therapist, you're slightly more traveling uphill than if you treat them in a group. Their trust of others is greater, and where they can learn better about others' failure as well as success in mentalizing by observation. And they benefit from that in ways that make them more robust in relation to their own internal and social experience.
You know, it's really interesting because I was not planning on mentioning our MOM trial that was published last year, in which we ran a randomized controlled trial administering MBT for patients with antisocial personality disorder, or actually offenders with antisocial personality disorder. But everything you described right now exactly explained why the intervention worked for this very traumatized population. And I wonder what differences or do you find between the MOAM population and the current MBT-TF, which is ran within the NHS services? Like, what are the differences in there? Because when it's in terms of the group, maybe that's to be more specific.
There are differences. At what point those differences are pertinent to therapy is quite a subtle and important, nuanced question. So I believe that mentalizing is a generic capacity that helps you navigate a social world. If you are, because of your past experiences, drifted towards antisocial behavior, and you find yourself stuck in a wing of a prison, mentalizing is not unequivocally helpful to you, because if you think too much about what other people are thinking or feeling, you're liable to get beaten up by others. So it's a something capacity that has to be applied knowingly. If you have someone, depending on their social context, if you're someone who comes from an experience of abuse, and we work with young people like that, and you send that young person with that improved mentalizing back into a social context, but they carry on being maltreated and abused, that is going to be an unhelpful intervention. What I'm getting at, Karen, is that what you're drawing attention to is that mentalizing, as I said, is to do with understanding others, understanding the self, and understanding using those capacities, social environment you're in. And then mentalizing is the coordination of the social environment, self-understanding, and the understanding of the other. That's why it's so complicated. So we have to take into account that most of the people who are antisocial live in a social environment that's sometimes dramatically different, and help them adjust to that through better understanding of others, through better understanding of themselves, and through better understanding of the social. People with complex trauma often are in relationships that they have created where they carry on being traumatized in the current relationship. At least my patients frequently do. And what I have to help them understand is in what way that relationship actually serves to protect them from a dysfunction, a disorganization of their sense of self, by having found someone who will be maltreating them. Because otherwise, they would feel that maltreating force is inside of them, destroying themselves, destroying them from within. But actually, by repeating a maltreating relationship, they actually are freed of that, and they find this maltreating individual outside. Now, that's quite a complicated idea. That's a social relationship that might take some time to help them work through. But I do believe that we do well, whether we react to that kind of dynamic by trying to be antisocial and destroy the adverse, destructive influence that we projected outside from within, and to help us survive, and we then try and destroy it and be an antisocial, or to submit to it and be traumatized yet again and yet again and yet again. That these are kind of different ways of dealing with the same disorganized cell structure that disorganized attachment leaves an individual with. And doing that without taking into consideration the social environment that our patient is in is not doing them a good service. So I have, over the years, have become much, much more sympathetic that so much of what benefits a patient that we treat actually happens outside of the consulting. And that my role as a therapist is less to do with me trying to get my patients resolve an unconscious conflict or whatever it is, and much more to be part of a social communication, but they're able to trust and they're able to learn, and but they don't respond irrationally to their suspicion or their fear or their irrational expectations of even benefit.
Yeah, and I think a definitely take-home message from me, from what you said, is really how, I mean, we do give so much more emphasis now compared to, I don't know, traditional psychoanalysis on the external environment, but we still need to focus even more on where are we sending our patients when they get out of the room, especially if they have a history of trauma. So that's, maybe one thing we can take from it. And I would like maybe to move now into more kind of maybe general questions toward nearing the end of our interview. And, you've been involved in so many clinical trials and national and governmental committees shaping services. So I wonder if, from your point of view, is there anything you can share with us on how mental health systems can become better prepared, both for preventing avoidable trauma or build resilience in the face of unavoidable mass trauma, such as, I don't know, war and natural disasters, or if you have any kind of...
listen, if I really knew what I was doing, then I wouldn't be talking to you. I would be trying to get that done. But listen, I do think that MBT has a message that's social, and that is to do with how attachment, mentalizing, and trusting others works together as three forces that protect society as well as the individuals within the society. So we run into trouble, and deep trouble, when we create a society that is not understanding, not mentalizing of others, and creating, which I have been trying to do, a system of service delivery within social care and within mental health that is more understanding of the child as early as we can bring it, is I think a gift of MBT, even if it's not MBT as a therapy that we deliver. I can cope with MBT being way down the line as not the most effective treatment in many contexts. What I really want to insist on is that we take the perspective of creating a mentalizing environment for the child by modifying their school environment, by modifying their family environment, by modifying their peer environment, by modifying the wider social environment. So it enhances rather than inhibits the willingness to trust others, to be open to others' influence, and to trust that influence to teach one to adapt to the society that we live in. We run into trouble in the broader social world when we close our minds and when we are too certain that we know. We do much better by being open to alternatives. And that has been my approach to advising ministers and bringing mental health into schools that I feel most proud of in this country anyway, and also perhaps to some degree making the mental health system prioritize choice in terms of, as long as it's evidence-based, in terms of what we present people with, which actually makes them feel that their feelings, their thoughts matter.
I think this is a lovely ending point and very inspirational one. So I want to thank you so much for your time and your willingness to be our guest here. And thank you for our listeners for being with us. You can follow the ESTSS on Blue Sky and LinkedIn and find us in ESTSS.org. And join us next time for another conversation bridging research, clinical practice, and international collaborations. Thank you so much, Peter.
Thank you very much for having me.